The chrome bumper caught sunlight like a broken promise as Martha Hayes pulled her 1953 Ford into the gravel lot behind Riverside Baptist Church. Every head in that Alabama parking lot turned, not in admiration, but in something closer to pity mixed with scandal. Because this was June 10th, 1967, and Martha Hayes was about to marry Thomas Brennan in a car held together by rust, prayer, and duct tape older than her 7-year-old daughter. Inside the church vestibule, the air tasted like magnolia blossoms and judgment. Lace curtains filtered afternoon light into golden bars across worn floorboards that still bore scuff marks from generations of Sunday shoes. The scent of old hymnals mixed with fresh-cut gardenias someone had wired to every pew end, their white petals already browning at the edges in the Alabama heat. Martha's hands trembled as she adjusted the second-hand veil her sister had altered 3 times to hide the moth holes. Through the crack in the door, she could hear the murmurs rippling through the congregation like wind through wheat. "Did you see that car? Bless her heart, showing up like that. Thomas could have done so much better." Her daughter Sarah pressed against her side, small fingers clutching the fabric of Martha's dress, a simple cream cotton number from the clearance rack at Woolworth's. The child's eyes were too knowing for 7 years old, already fluent in the language of whispered cruelty. "Mama, why are they talking like that?" Martha knelt, smoothing Sarah's dark curls. "Because people forget that kindness costs nothing, baby girl." But even as she said it, Martha felt the weight of every unpaid bill, every missed meal stretched into 2. Every night she'd lain awake calculating whether the rent or the electric bill would get paid that month. Thomas knew about the poverty, had known from the start when they'd met at the diner where she worked double shifts. He'd proposed anyway, with a quiet certainty that had made her believe, just maybe, that love could be enough. The organ wheezed into "Here Comes the Bride." Martha rose, took Sarah's hand, and stepped into the aisle. That's when she saw him. 3rd row, left side, a man in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than her annual salary. His silver hair swept back from a face that carried the comfortable ease of inherited wealth. She didn't recognize him, didn't know his name or why he was there. But his eyes met hers as she passed, and something in his expression wasn't pity. It was recognition. Before we go any further, pause for just a moment. Comment below and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. And if this story already has you curious about what happens next, hit that like button and subscribe. You're exactly where you need to be. The ceremony itself passed in a blur of trembling vows and Sarah's whispered question about whether Mama was really happy now. Thomas slipped the simple gold band onto Martha's finger, his grandmother's ring, the only heirloom his family hadn't sold during the Depression. His eyes were steady, kind, full of promises he meant to keep. "I now pronounce you husband and wife." The congregation offered polite applause, not enthusiastic, not warm, just the bare minimum of social obligation. But then, as Martha and Thomas turned to walk back down the aisle as man and wife, the silver-haired man in the 3rd row stood. He didn't wait for them to pass. He stepped directly into the aisle, blocking their path. The church fell silent. Thomas's hand tightened on Martha's, protective, ready. The stranger reached into his jacket pocket, and for one terrible moment Martha thought this was it. The moment when poverty became something worse, when desperation turned violent, when whatever fragile hope she'd allowed herself would shatter across these worn floorboards. Instead, he pulled out a set of car keys, silver, gleaming, attached to a leather fob embossed with 3 letters, RLS. "Mrs. Brennan," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of that silent sanctuary. "A woman who raises a child alone, works 2 jobs, and still finds the courage to believe in love deserves to arrive at her wedding in something better than a car held together by rust and hope." He pressed the keys into her palm. "There's a 1967 Cadillac DeVille parked on the street. Midnight blue. Titles in the glove box, already signed over to you." Martha stared at the keys, then at the stranger's face. "I don't understand," she whispered. His smile was sad, knowing, weighted with something she couldn't name. "You will." And then he walked past them, past the stunned congregation, past the minister still frozen mid-blessing, and out the door into the Alabama afternoon. The church erupted into chaos, but Martha stood perfectly still, the keys heavy in her hand, and wondered what she'd just accepted and what price it would eventually demand. Because in her experience, nothing was ever truly free. Thomas found his voice first, though it came out strangled and small. "Martha, what just happened?" The honest answer was she had no idea. The keys felt impossibly heavy in her palm, their metal edges pressing small indentations into her skin that would still be visible hours later. Around them, the congregation had dissolved into a hurricane of speculation. Voices rising and falling, theories spinning faster than cotton on a mill wheel. "Did you see that car outside? Robert Lee Sterling just gave away a Cadillac like it was pocket change. Who is she to him?" That last question landed like a slap. Martha's face burned. She turned to Thomas, needing him to understand something she didn't fully grasp herself. "I've never met that man in my life. I swear it." Thomas studied her face with the quiet intensity that had made her fall in love with him in the first place. A factory worker didn't survive Alabama's textile mills without learning to read truth from lies, danger from safety. After a moment that stretched like taffy, he nodded. "I believe you." Sarah tugged at Martha's dress. "Mama, can we see the car? Please?" The reception was supposed to happen in the church basement. Punch and cake, a borrowed record player, maybe an hour of awkward small talk before everyone could politely leave. But Martha's feet were already carrying her toward the door, drawn by a curiosity that felt dangerous and necessary in equal measure. Outside, the Alabama sun hit like a physical force. The air shimmered above the asphalt, carrying the smell of fresh-cut grass and motor oil from the Texaco station 2 blocks over. And there, parked at the curb where her rust bucket should have been the only eyesore, sat a vehicle that looked like it had rolled straight out of a magazine advertisement. Midnight blue, just as the stranger had said. Chrome gleaming, white leather interior visible through windows so clean they could have been invisible. The Cadillac sat low and sleek and utterly impossible among the modest Chevys and Fords that lined Riverside Baptist Street. A crowd had already gathered. Martha recognized faces from the congregation, from the diner, from Sarah's school. Mrs. Hutchinson from the church auxiliary pressed a gloved hand to her chest. Mr. Patterson, who owned the hardware store, let out a low whistle. "That's a $10,000 automobile," someone muttered. $10,000. Martha's brain tried to process the number and failed. That was more than twice what she'd earned in the past 3 years combined. Thomas approached the car slowly, reverently, like it might vanish if he moved too fast. He peered through the driver's window. Keys are in the ignition, and there's an envelope on the seat. Martha's hands shook as she opened the door, unlocked, trusting, as if the stranger had known she'd come. The interior smelled of new leather and possibility. She reached for the envelope, her name, written across the front in elegant script that spoke of expensive education and careful breeding. Inside, a single sheet of cream-colored stationery. Mrs. Martha Brennan, 17 years ago, a woman showed me kindness when I had nothing. She fed me when I was hungry, gave me work when I was desperate, and asked for nothing in return. Her name was Martha Hayes. I have spent 2 decades searching for her, wanting to repay the debt. This morning, I learned she passed away last winter. Then I heard about a Martha Hayes getting married today at Riverside Baptist. I came hoping, praying it might be her. Instead, I found her daughter, carrying her name, her grace, and her courage. The car is not charity. It is a debt 17 years overdue, paid to the right person. Your mother saved my life. Please accept this as the gratitude I can no longer give her. Robert Lee Sterling. The letter fluttered from Martha's fingers. Around her, the crowd pressed closer, everyone talking at once, demanding to know what the letter said, what it meant, whether it was real. But Martha couldn't hear them over the roaring in her ears, over the memory of her mother's voice from a lifetime ago. Always help when you can, Martha girl. You never know who might need saving. Her mother. Her beautiful, tired, endlessly kind mother, who had worked herself into an early grave and died last January with $47 in her bank account and a heart too worn out to keep beating. This man, this Robert Lee Sterling with his silver hair and expensive suit, had known her, had been helped by her, had spent 17 years trying to find her. And now Martha held the keys to a debt she never knew existed. A debt that had just transformed from a rusted Ford into a midnight blue Cadillac worth more than everything she owned. Sarah's small voice cut through the chaos. Mama, why are you crying? Because generosity could hurt just as much as cruelty when you weren't used to it. Because her mother had died never knowing that her kindness had mattered this much. Because Martha was standing in a wedding dress that cost $12, holding keys to a car worth $10,000, and she had no idea what happened next. Thomas wrapped his arm around her shoulders, Schnuckchen present. We'll figure it out, he murmured. Together. But as Martha looked at the faces surrounding them, some awed, some envious, some calculating, she wondered if they'd just been handed a gift or a grenade. And where exactly Robert Lee Sterling had disappeared to. Because men who gave away Cadillacs like pocket change didn't usually vanish without wanting something in return. The reception happened anyway, though nobody could focus on punch and cake when a Cadillac worth more than most people's houses sat gleaming outside. Martha moved through the church basement in a daze, accepting congratulations that felt hollow and curious, fielding questions she couldn't answer. Sarah clung to her side, sensitive to the strange energy crackling through the room like electricity before a storm. Thomas stood close, his presence a steady anchor, but even he kept glancing toward the stairs, as if expecting Robert Lee Sterling to reappear with explanations. It was Thomas's cousin William, a mechanic at the Ford dealership in Montgomery, who finally broke through the speculation with information that changed everything. I know who Robert Lee Sterling is, William announced, his voice cutting through the chatter. The room fell silent. Everyone in Alabama knows that name. Or should. Martha's stomach dropped. Sterling Textiles, William continued, owns half the mills between here and Atlanta. His family's been in cotton since before the Civil War. He's worth... William paused, seeming to calculate. Conservative estimate? $15 million. 15 million. The number was so large it lost all meaning, like trying to count stars or measure ocean. Mrs. Hutchinson gasped. "That's Sterling? The one who testified before Congress last year about mill conditions?" "The very same," William confirmed. "Made a lot of enemies, too. Pushed for safety regulations, fair wages, better hours. Cost him contracts, lost him friends. But he didn't back down." Martha's mind raced, trying to reconcile the man who'd handed her car keys with this portrait of industrial power and reformist courage. What had her mother done for someone like that? What kind of help had she offered that could possibly warrant this response? Thomas's Uncle Frank, who'd worked at Sterling Textiles for 30 years, spoke up from the corner. "I remember when Robert Sterling was just a boy. His daddy ran those mills like a feudal lord. Dangerous conditions, poverty wages, no regard for human life. Robert was maybe 19, 20 when he tried to stand up to his father about it." "What happened?" someone asked. Frank's expression darkened. "Old man Sterling threw him out, disowned him completely, cut him off without a cent, and told him if he couldn't stomach the family business, he could learn what real poverty felt like." The pieces began clicking into place. Martha thought about the letter's words. "A woman showed me kindness when I had nothing. Not when he was down on his luck. When he had nothing." "When was this?" Martha asked quietly. "Summer of 1950, Frank replied. "I remember because it was just after the polio epidemic. Half the mill workers were sick or caring for sick children, and old Sterling wouldn't even give them time off. Robert pushed back, and his father made an example of him." 1950. Martha would have been 4 years old, but her mother would have been 27, working 2 jobs herself, barely scraping by after Martha's father had abandoned them. And somehow, in the middle of her own desperate poverty, she'd found room to help a disowned rich boy who'd lost everything. The kindness costs nothing principle, lived out in real time. "What happened to him after that?" Thomas asked. Frank shrugged. "Disappeared for a couple years. Rumors said he was working day labor, living rough, really learning what life was like for the people his family had exploited. Then, in '52, his father had a heart attack. Robert came back, took over the mills, and started changing everything. Slowly at first, then faster. By '65, Sterling Textiles had the best safety record and highest wages in the South. Also the smallest profit margins, which is why the other mill owners hate him, a man who'd lost everything and clawed his way back. A man who'd been reformed by poverty rather than broken by it. A man who'd spent 17 years searching for the woman who'd helped him when he had nothing. And Martha's mother had been that woman. The weight of it pressed down on her like summer humidity. Her mother, who died exhausted and poor, had changed the trajectory of a man who now employed thousands, who'd fought Congress for worker protections, who'd transformed an exploitative empire into something approaching justice, and she'd never known. Had died never knowing. "Mama?" Sarah's voice was small, uncertain. "Is the car really ours to keep?" Martha knelt, pulling her daughter close. "Yes, baby, it's really ours. Because Grandma was kind to a stranger. Because Grandma was kind, period." But even as Martha said it, she felt the weight of what this gift meant. In 1967 Alabama, a single mother showing up to her wedding in a rust bucket was one thing. Poor but honest. Sympathetic even. A single mother suddenly driving a $10,000 Cadillac was something else entirely. The whispers had already started. Martha could hear them weaving through the reception like smoke. Questions about her relationship with Sterling, speculation about whether Thomas knew what he was getting into, cruel jokes about payment for services rendered. She'd accepted the keys, thinking they were the answer to prayers she'd been too tired to pray. But standing in that church basement, surrounded by faces that mixed awe with suspicion, Martha began to understand that Robert Lee Sterling's generosity had just painted a target on her back. The question was whether the gift was worth the cost, and whether anyone would believe the truth even if she told it. The honeymoon was supposed to be 2 nights at a modest motel in Gulf Shores, paid for with money Thomas had saved over 6 months of overtime shifts. Instead, they drove home in the Cadillac while their rust-bucket Ford sat abandoned in the church parking lot like a shed skin. Sarah fell asleep in the back seat, her small body stretched across white leather that probably cost more than Martha's monthly rent. Thomas's hands gripped the steering wheel with the careful reverence of a man handling something that might shatter. "I don't know if I should be driving this," he admitted as they turned onto the dirt road leading to the shotgun house Martha and Sarah had been renting. "Feel like I'm going to scratch it just by looking at it wrong." Martha stared out the window at familiar poverty sliding past. Mrs. Johnson's laundry flapping on a line strung between 2 posts. The Miller boys playing barefoot in a yard more dirt than grass. Mr. Patterson's truck up on blocks. Had been for 3 years now. And here they came, rolling up in a vehicle worth more than every car on this street combined. "We could sell it," Martha said quietly. Thomas glanced at her, surprise flickering across his face. "What?" "Sell the Cadillac. Buy something sensible. Use the rest for a down payment on a real house. Maybe save some for Sarah's future." It made perfect sense. Practical. Responsible. The kind of decision her mother would have made. But Thomas was already shaking his head. "That man didn't track down your family after 17 years to give you something practical, Martha. He gave you this specific car for a reason." "What reason? To make us targets for every thief and gossip in Mobile County?" "To say your mother's kindness mattered." Thomas's voice was firm. "To say she deserved to see her daughter riding in something beautiful. That her generosity should be honored, not hidden away or converted into something sensible." Martha felt tears burn behind her eyes. Because Thomas was right, and because keeping the car felt dangerous in ways she couldn't quite articulate, they pulled up to the shotgun house just as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting everything in shades of amber and shadow. Martha's landlord, Mr. Dawson, sat on his own porch 3 houses down. Even from this distance, she could see him lean forward, squinting at the Cadillac like it was a mirage. Within minutes, doors started opening. Neighbors emerging to stare. Mrs. Chen from next door approached slowly, her weathered face creased with curiosity. Brennan, is that your car?" "It is," Martha said, lifting her chin slightly, refusing to apologize or explain. "Must be nice," Mrs. Chen said, and the words carried more weight than admiration. "Some people work their whole lives and never see anything like that." The implication hung in the air like humidity. "What did you do to earn it?" Thomas stepped forward, his body, language protective. "It was a gift, from a man whose life Martha's mother saved years ago, a debt being repaid." Mrs. Chen's expression softened slightly, but Martha could see the skepticism lingering. Stories like that didn't happen to people like them. Miracles were for other folks, people with connections and advantages. When good fortune found the desperate, there was usually a catch. Over the next 3 days, Martha learned exactly how heavy a gift could become. The landlord raised her rent, citing the Cadillac as proof she could afford more. Never mind that she hadn't cashed a paycheck yet, that the car itself couldn't pay for groceries or keep the lights on. At the diner where Martha waitressed, her boss cut her hours. Figure you don't need the work anymore. What with rich friends buying you luxury cars. The mothers at Sarah's school stopped, including the girl in playground games. Children learned cruelty from their parents, absorbed suspicions like lessons, and Sarah came home 3 afternoons in a row with tear-stained cheeks and questions Martha couldn't answer. Why do they say mean things about you, Mama? Because people don't understand kindness anymore, baby. But it was worse than that, and Martha knew it. The Cadillac had transformed her from sympathetic poor to suspicious nouveau riche. She'd violated an unspoken rule of poverty. You could dream of escape, but you couldn't actually achieve it without arousing suspicion about how you'd managed it. By Friday, Thomas came home from the mill with a split lip and scraped knuckles. Martha's heart dropped. What happened? Jerry Hoskins started running his mouth about you and Sterling, said things I won't repeat. Thomas's jaw was tight. I told him to stop. He didn't. So I made him. Martha cleaned his wounds with shaking hands, fury and fear warring in her chest. This was the cost. Not just gossip, but violence. Not just suspicion, but concrete harm to the people she loved. That night, after Sarah was asleep, Martha sat at their scarred kitchen table with the Cadillac's title in front of her. Thomas joined her, 2 cups of weak coffee between them. We could still sell it, she said. We could. Make everything go back to normal. Thomas reached across the table, covering her hand with his. Martha, nothing was normal before. You were working yourself to death. Sarah was growing up watching her mother break piece by piece. We were living month to month, one emergency away from disaster. But we were safe. Were we? Thomas's eyes held hers. Or were we just comfortable with our suffering? The question hit like a fist to the sternum, because he was right. She'd worn her poverty like armor, proof of her virtue and her mother's sacrifice. The struggle had given her identity, purpose, a way to measure her worth. And the Cadillac had stripped all that away, forcing her to confront the possibility that she deserved something better. That her mother's kindness hadn't just mattered, it had earned something extraordinary. I'm scared, Martha whispered. Me too. Thomas squeezed her hand. But I'd rather be scared in a Cadillac than safe in a rust bucket. Despite everything, Martha laughed. A real laugh, breaking through the tension like sunlight through storm clouds. But her laughter died when headlights swept across their windows. Too slow to be someone just passing by. Too deliberate to be accidental. A car had stopped outside their house. Engine idling. Waiting. And Martha realized that the real cost of Robert Lee Sterling's gift hadn't even begun to come due. Thomas moved to the window first, his body instinctively placing itself between his family and whatever waited outside. The car was a black Lincoln Continental, late model, expensive but not flashy. Nothing like the Cadillac. The kind of vehicle a businessman would drive, or a detective, or someone who needed to project authority without drawing attention. Its headlights cut yellow cones through the gathering darkness, illuminating the Cadillac parked in their dirt driveway like a spotlight on evidence. Stay with Sarah, Thomas murmured. But Martha was already moving past him, something fierce and protective rising in her chest. She'd spent 3 days watching her gift become a curse, watching her daughter cry, watching her husband fight. If someone had come to threaten them, to demand explanations or make accusations, they'd face her first. She stepped onto the porch, the screen door creaking behind her. The June night smelled of honeysuckle and coming rain, the air thick enough to swim through. The Lincoln's door opened. A man emerged, mid-40s, in a gray suit that was professional rather than wealthy. He carried a leather briefcase and moved with the careful neutrality of someone trained to enter hostile situations. When he spotted Martha, he raised one hand in a gesture that was meant to be reassuring, but only made her more nervous. "Mrs. Brennan?" His accent was local but educated, softened by years in courtrooms or boardrooms. "I apologize for the late hour. My name is David Winters. I'm an attorney with Sterling Textiles." Martha's stomach clenched. "If Mr. Sterling wants his car back—" "No, ma'am." Winters climbed the porch steps slowly, keeping his movements visible and unthreatening. "Mr. Sterling sent me to ensure you received something he should have included with the automobile. May I?" He opened the briefcase, withdrawing a manila envelope thick with documents. Martha took it with trembling fingers, her mind racing through possibilities, each worse than the last. Legal contracts, strings attached, conditions she'd unknowingly agreed to by accepting those keys. What is this? Insurance documentation, for one thing. Full coverage paid through 1970. Maintenance records showing the vehicle's service history. And Winters paused, his expression softening slightly. A letter from Mr. Sterling that he realized he should have included originally. "He's been quite distressed to hear about the difficulties you've faced this week." Martha's head snapped up. "How does he know about that?" "Mr. Sterling maintains, let's call them connections throughout the state. When word reached him that his gift had created problems rather than solved them, he wanted to address the situation immediately." Thomas had joined Martha on the porch now, his presence solid at her shoulder. "What kind of addressing are we talking about?" Winters reached into the briefcase again, this time producing a checkbook. "Mr. Sterling would like to offer compensation for any income lost, opportunities denied, or hardships created by his gift. Simply name a figure, and I'm authorized—" "No." Martha's voice cut through the humid air like a blade. "Tell Mr. Sterling thank you, but no." Winters blinked, clearly surprised. "Mrs. Brennan, I assure you Mr. Sterling's intentions are entirely honorable. He simply wishes to—" "I know what he wishes to do." Martha's hands clenched around the envelope. "He wishes to fix the problem his generosity created. But taking his money now would prove everyone right. Would confirm every ugly thing they've whispered about me this week." "Martha," Thomas said quietly, "we could use— I know what we could use." She turned to face her husband, needing him to understand. "But the moment I accept payment, I stop being the daughter of a kind woman who helped a stranger. I become a woman who profited from manufactured connection. I become exactly what they think I am." The truth of it settled over them like dew. Robert Lee Sterling's kindness was genuine, but it existed in a world where everything had a price, where debts were tallied and transactions recorded. In that world, his gift made perfect sense. But Martha lived in a different world, one where accepting money from a wealthy man, even for legitimate reasons, would destroy her reputation and, more importantly, her daughter's future. Sarah would grow up being the girl whose mother took payoffs from millionaires. The stain would follow her into classrooms, onto playgrounds, eventually into job interviews and marriage prospects. Some gifts were too expensive to accept, no matter how generous the giver. Winters studied Martha's face for a long moment. Then, surprisingly, he smiled. "You're exactly like he described her." "Excuse me?" "Your mother." Mr. Sterling told me about her. Said she had a spine made of Damascus steel and a heart that could shame angels. Said she refused payment then, too. Insisted that helping people wasn't a transaction. Martha felt something crack open in her chest. To hear her mother described this way by a stranger, to have her remembered as strong rather than just tired, mattered more than any check ever could. There is one thing in that envelope that isn't optional, Winters continued. The second letter. Mr. Sterling asked me to wait while you read it, in case you have questions. Martha opened the envelope with Thomas reading over her shoulder. Past the insurance documents and service records, she found a single page in that same elegant script. Dear Martha, by now you've learned that generosity can be its own burden. I'm sorry. I should have anticipated this. Your mother taught me something I've spent 17 years trying to honor, that true kindness expects nothing in return. Not gratitude, not recognition, not even acceptance. So I won't insult you by offering money or attempting to fix the problems I've created. Instead, I offer information. The Cadillac is titled in your name, free and clear. But I've also established a trust fund in Sarah's name, $50,000, to be accessed only for education. She cannot touch it, and neither can you, except for tuition, books, and school-related expenses. This is not payment. This is insurance that your mother's granddaughter will have opportunities your mother never did. If you reject this, the money will sit untouched until Sarah turns 18, at which point she can decide for herself. I owe your mother my life. Please let me owe her this much. Robert Lee Sterling, $50,000 for Sarah's education. Martha's knees went weak. Thomas caught her elbow, steadying her, his own face pale with shock. That was enough for college, for graduate school if Sarah wanted it, for a future that didn't include waitressing double shifts or marrying young out of economic desperation. He can't do this, Martha whispered. He already has, Winters said gently. The trust is established. The only question is whether you'll fight it, which will cost you legal fees you can't afford and ultimately change nothing, or accept it as what it is, a grandfather's gift to a child he'll never meet, paid forward from a debt he can never fully repay. A grandfather's gift. That framing changed everything. Not payment to Martha, but inheritance to Sarah. Not transaction, but legacy. The kind of thing families did for each other across generations. The kind of thing Martha's mother would have done if she'd had anything to leave behind. Thomas's voice was rough with emotion. What do we tell people? The truth, Winters said simply. That a man your mother-in-law saved created an educational trust for her granddaughter. Nothing more, nothing less. Anyone who finds that suspicious wasn't going to think well of you anyway. He was right. Martha could feel it in her bones. The people who'd whispered this week would whisper regardless. But Sarah would have choices, opportunities, a life built on something more than survival. Tell Mr. Sterling. Martha's voice broke. She cleared her throat and tried again. Tell him my mother would be proud, and thank you. Winters nodded, something like relief crossing his features. One more thing. Mr. Sterling wanted you to know that if you ever need anything at all, you have only to ask. He considers your family his family now. After Winters drove away, Martha and Thomas stood on their porch, watching fireflies blink like small miracles in the darkness. Sarah's future was secure. The Cadillac gleamed in the driveway, no longer just a car, but a symbol of something larger than both of them. But Martha couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end of the story. That somewhere, Consequences were still gathering like storm clouds, and they were about to break. Martha sensed didn't come from the sky. It came 7 days later, on a Tuesday afternoon, in the form of 3 men in suits climbing out of a mud-spattered Chevrolet Impala and walking straight into the diner where Martha was refilling coffee for the lunch shift. The lunch crowd went silent the way small animals do when predators enter their territory. Instinct, recognition that something dangerous had arrived wearing human skin. Martha knew them by type, if not by name. Mill owners, or their representatives. Men who'd built fortunes on the backs of people like her mother, who saw workers as numbers on balance sheets, rather than human beings with hungry children and impossible choices. The eldest of the 3, maybe 60, with iron-gray hair and a face carved by decades of getting exactly what he wanted, took a seat at the counter. His companions flanked him like bookends. "Coffee," he said. Not a request, a command. Martha's hands didn't shake as she poured. She'd served worse men than this, but she felt the weight of his attention like a physical thing, measuring her, calculating her worth and weakness. "You're Martha Brennan," he said. Not a question. "I am. Born Martha Hayes, daughter of Martha Hayes Sr., deceased." He pulled out a photograph, sliding it across the Formica counter. This woman. The picture showed her mother at maybe 25, younger than Martha was now. Standing outside a boarding house Martha barely remembered, wearing a house dress and an expression of exhausted determination that transcended time. "Where did you get that?" Martha's voice came out harder than she intended. "Where I get everything, Mrs. Brennan, by paying attention." He withdrew the photograph, tucking it back into his jacket. "My name is Harrison Whitmore. I own Whitmore Mills, and I'm here to discuss a problem." Martha set down the coffee pot carefully. The diner's owner, Mr. Kowalski, had emerged from the kitchen, his expression worried but loyal. At the corner booth, 2 regulars, Bill Santos and his brother Mike, both union men, had stopped eating, their attention locked on the confrontation unfolding at the counter. "I don't have problems with you, Mr. Whitmore. But I have one with you, or rather, with your benefactor." Whitmore's smile was cold enough to frost glass. "Robert Lee Sterling has been a thorn in my side for 15 years, raising wages, implementing safety standards, making the rest of us look like villains for maintaining industry standards that have worked perfectly well for a century." "Then take it up with him." "Oh, I intend to. But first I thought we should have a conversation about gratitude and consequences." Whitmore leaned forward slightly. "You see, Mrs. Brennan, Mr. Sterling's little performance at your wedding, giving away automobiles, establishing trust funds, it sends a message. It tells every mill worker in Alabama that if they're just kind enough, charitable enough, lucky enough, some wealthy patron will swoop in and save them." Martha's jaw tightened. "That's not what happened." "Isn't it? You showed basic human decency to a stranger, and 17 years later you're driving a Cadillac. That's quite the return on investment." Whitmore's voice carried across the diner, meant for every ear. "But here's what that story doesn't mention. Your mother worked herself to death. She died poor and exhausted at 52 because she gave away resources she needed for her own survival. Is that really the lesson we want to teach people? That charity pays?" The words landed like acid. Because he was partially right, and Martha hated him for it. Her mother had died too young, worn down by double shifts and stretched budgets and the constant pressure of trying to survive while maintaining her humanity. The kindness she'd shown Robert Sterling hadn't been rewarded in her lifetime, only after, when it was too late to save her. "My mother," Martha said, her voice steady and clear. Taught me that we help people because it's right, not because it pays, not because someone might remember, because that's what it means to be human. How noble. Whitmore's sneer was razor thin. And how convenient, now that you're reaping the rewards. But let me tell you what happens when workers start believing in fairy tales. They start making demands, expecting raises, safe conditions, dignity. They start thinking they deserve more than survival wages because surely, if they're just good enough, someone will reward them. They do deserve those things, Martha shot back. Every person who works deserves fair wages and safe conditions. That's not a fairy tale. That's basic human decency. And who pays for it? Whitmore's voice rose. When Sterling raises wages at his mills, he cuts into profit margins. When he implements safety equipment, he drives up production costs. And when costs rise, contracts go elsewhere. To mills in Mississippi, in Georgia, in states where owners haven't been infected by his bleeding heart nonsense. You know what that means? Layoffs. Good people losing their jobs because their employer decided to play hero. The argument had a seductive logic. Martha could see how it worked on people who wanted simple answers to complex problems. But she'd also seen the alternative. Her mother's early grave, Thomas's split lip, Sarah crying because classmates said cruel things their parents taught them. She'd seen what happened when people like Harrison Whitmore got to define how the world worked. "You didn't come here to lecture me about economics," Martha said. "What do you want?" Whitmore's smile returned, predatory and pleased. "I want you to give the car back. Tell Sterling thanks, but no thanks. Make a public statement that you don't need his charity, that you're proud to earn your own way. Be the example that destroys his narrative. And if I don't, then I'll be forced to share some information I've recently acquired." Whitmore pulled out another photograph. This one showed a young Robert Sterling, maybe 19, gaunt and desperate looking, standing outside the same boarding house from the earlier picture. "Did Sterling tell you what he was doing when your mother helped him? He wasn't just a disowned rich boy learning life lessons. He was working as a union organizer, trying to foment worker rebellions against his own father's mills." Martha's blood chilled. In 1967 Alabama, union organizing was dangerous enough. But this photograph was from 1950, before the modest protections won since then, when union men simply disappeared or turned up drowned in rivers. "He was trying to destroy his family's business from the inside," Whitmore continued, "using his insider knowledge to organize strikes, sabotage production, cost his father millions. And your mother—" His smile widened. "Your mother knowingly harbored him, fed him, gave him shelter while he plotted industrial sabotage." The implications crashed over Martha like a wave. If Whitmore released this information, it wouldn't just tarnish Sterling's reputation. It would rewrite her mother's legacy, transform her from a kind woman who helped a stranger into a radical sympathizer who'd aided economic terrorism. Never mind that helping hungry people was never wrong. Never mind that Sterling's father had been a monster who'd destroyed lives for profit. In the court of public opinion, nuance didn't matter. Only narrative. "You're lying," Martha said, but her voice wavered. "Am I? Ask Sterling yourself." Whitmore stood, dropping $1 on the counter for coffee he hadn't touched. "You have until Friday to make your decision. Keep the Cadillac and your mother becomes a footnote in a story about radical organizing. Or return it, make a statement, and she stays the saint in Sterling's redemption arc." He walked toward the door, his companions following like shadows. At the threshold, he turned back. "Oh, and Mrs. Brennan? That trust fund for your daughter? I'd think very carefully about whether you want her college years funded by money that might be connected to historical labor violence. Universities tend to ask questions about large anonymous donations these days. Then he was gone, leaving Martha standing in a diner that smelled of coffee and grease and betrayal, holding a pot that had gone cold while her entire world tilted on its axis. Bill Santos spoke first, his voice carrying across the silent room. That son of a bitch is lying. But Martha wasn't sure anymore. She'd accepted keys to a Cadillac from a man she didn't know, based on a story she couldn't verify, honoring a debt she'd never witnessed. What if her mother's kindness had been more complicated than she knew? What if every gift came with a price she was only now beginning to understand? Martha called the number on David Winters's business card from the payphone outside the diner, her hands shaking so badly she had to dial twice. He answered on the third ring. Winters. This is Martha Brennan. I need to speak with Robert Sterling. Now. 30 minutes later, she sat in the parking lot of Riverside Baptist Church, the only neutral ground she could think of, waiting in the Cadillac that had become both blessing and curse. Thomas had wanted to come, but Martha needed to face this alone. Needed to look Sterling in the eye and hear the truth about her mother, without anyone else's emotions clouding her judgment. The black Lincoln Continental pulled up at exactly 3 o'clock. Robert Lee Sterling emerged, looking older and more tired than he had at the wedding. He approached the Cadillac slowly, and Martha rolled down the window. Mrs. Brennan, Mr. Winters said it was urgent. Get in. Sterling hesitated, then walked around to the passenger side. The car dipped slightly as he settled into the white leather seat. Up close, Martha could see the lines around his eyes, the silver threading through his hair, the weight of decades carried in the set of his shoulders. Harrison Whitmore came to see me, Martha said without preamble. He had photographs, stories. He said you were a union organizer, that my mother knowingly harbored someone plotting against his own family's business. Sterling was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice carried the texture of old grief. He's not entirely wrong. Martha's stomach dropped. Let me tell you what really happened, Sterling continued. Summer of 1950. I was 20 years old and convinced I could change the world. My father's mills were death traps. Inadequate ventilation, dangerous machinery, cotton dust so thick men drowned in it without ever touching water. Brown lung disease killed more workers than accidents, and my father treated both as acceptable business costs. He stared through the windshield at the church where Martha had married, where this entire complicated mess had begun. I tried to change things from the inside, begged my father to implement basic safety measures. He laughed in my face, said workers were replaceable, that if they didn't like the conditions, they could find work elsewhere. Except there was nowhere else. He and men like Whitmore controlled every mill for 100 miles. Martha's throat was tight, but she stayed silent. So yes, I started organizing. Quietly at first, then more openly. I used my insider knowledge, production schedules, financial records, shipping routes. I helped workers understand their leverage, their power. And when my father found out, he didn't just disown me, he had me beaten. Broken ribs, fractured jaw. Left me in an alley like garbage. Sterling's hands clenched in his lap. Your mother found me there. 3 a.m, on her way home from a night shift at the cannery. She didn't know who I was. Didn't care. She dragged me to her boarding house, cleaned my wounds, fed me soup I couldn't chew. And when I was well enough to talk, I told her everything. What did she say? Martha whispered. She said that justice without mercy was just cruelty in a different uniform, that workers deserved better, but violence and sabotage would only give men like my father justification to crack down harder. Sterling's voice cracked. She said if I really wanted to change things, I needed to do it by becoming someone who had the power to make different choices. Martha felt tears tracking down her cheeks. That was her mother, exactly. The woman who'd always found the third option when the world presented only two. So I left Alabama, worked on oil rigs in Texas, learned business from the ground up. When my father had his heart attack in '52 and I inherited the mills, I started implementing every reform I'd demanded as a 20-year-old. Slowly enough not to bankrupt the company, but steadily enough that within 10 years, Sterling Textiles became the model everyone else fought against. Because you cut into their profits, Martha said, understanding. Because I proved their model was a choice, not a necessity. You can run profitable mills without killing your workers. Whitmore and his friends hate me because I'm living proof that their cruelty isn't required for success. It's just preferred because it's easier. The pieces were falling into place. The photograph Whitmore had showed wasn't evidence of terrorism. It was evidence that a young man had tried to fight a corrupt system and failed, then found another way, a better way. He wants me to give the car back, Martha said, to make a statement that I don't need your charity. He says if I don't, he'll destroy my mother's reputation, make her look like a radical who harbored a criminal. Sterling's jaw tightened. That's Harrison's specialty. He can't win on facts, so he wins on narrative, twists truth until it becomes weapon. He turned to face Martha directly. But here's what he's not counting on. I kept every letter your mother sent me over those 2 years. Every piece of advice, every encouragement to find a better way than violence. They're dated, postmarked, preserved. If Whitmore wants to paint her as a radical, I have documentary evidence proving she was the voice of reason that saved me from becoming everything he's trying to claim I was. Hope flickered in Martha's chest. He said the trust fund for Sarah could be connected to labor violence, that universities would investigate. The money came from textile patents I developed personally and sold to companies outside my family's business. Every cent is documented, taxed, and absolutely clean. Sterling's expression softened. Mrs. Brennan, Martha, I've spent 17 years preparing for someone like Whitmore to challenge this debt. I knew that the moment I repaid your mother's kindness, powerful men would try to twist it into something ugly, so I made sure everything was bulletproof. Martha closed her eyes, relief washing over her. So what do I do? You hold your head high. You keep the car. You let Sarah use her trust fund. And you tell Harrison Whitmore that Martha Hayes Sr. taught her daughter that kindness doesn't negotiate with cruelty. A laugh bubbled up from Martha's chest, half sob, half triumph, because that was exactly what her mother would have said. There's one more thing, Sterling said quietly. He reached into his jacket and withdrew a small leather journal, worn and water-stained. This was your mother's. She gave it to me before I left Alabama, said I might need reminding of why I was doing this. I've carried it for 17 years, but it belongs with her family now. Martha took the journal with trembling hands. Her mother's handwriting filled the pages, not a diary exactly, but a collection of thoughts, observations, small wisdoms accumulated over a hard life. She flipped to a random page and read, "Met a young man today who thinks he can save the world through anger. Reminded me of Martha's father before bitterness ate him alive. Tried to tell him anger is gasoline. It'll get you moving fast, but burns out quick. Justice needs steadier fuel. Hope, maybe. Or stubbornness. Lord knows I've got enough of both. Martha pressed the journal to her chest, feeling her mother's presence in every crease and stain. This was the woman who'd raised her. Not a saint, not a radical. Just someone who'd tried to leave the world slightly better than she'd found it. One small kindness at a time. "Thank you," Martha whispered. Sterling nodded, then reached for the door handle. But before he could leave, Martha stopped him with a question she needed answered. "Did you love her? My mother?" Sterling's face transformed, surprise giving way to something deeper, more vulnerable. "Not the way you mean. Not romantically. But yes, I loved her. She saved more than my life that summer. She saved my soul. And I spent 17 years trying to find a way to tell her that her kindness mattered. That she mattered." He climbed out of the Cadillac, then leaned back in through the open door. "Your mother changed the lives of thousands of workers who'll never know her name. She did it by changing one angry boy into a man who had the power to make different choices. That's a legacy worth defending." As Sterling drove away, Martha sat in the church parking lot, holding her mother's journal and watching the Alabama sun paint everything gold. Tomorrow she'd face Harrison Whitmore with Sterling's documented evidence. Next week she'd return to work at the diner with her head high. And someday she'd tell Sarah the whole complicated, beautiful truth about the grandmother who'd taught her that kindness was never wasted, even when the world tried to prove otherwise. The Cadillac's engine purred to life. Martha put it in gear and drove home to her husband and daughter, to the life her mother's courage had helped make possible. Justice without mercy was just cruelty in a different uniform, but mercy backed by truth? That was something even Harrison Whitmore couldn't destroy. On Friday morning arrived with the weight of a held breath. Martha stood in front of the bathroom mirror, pinning her hair into the same practical bun her mother had worn, and thought about all the ways a life could be measured. In dollars and cars, yes. But also in the quiet revolutions that happened when someone chose mercy over bitterness, hope over anger, kindness over the easier path of looking away. Harrison Whitmore had given her until today to make her decision public. Return the car, denounce Sterling's charity, or face the consequences of his manufactured scandal. She'd chosen a third option. The press conference was David Winters's idea, though Martha had insisted on the location. Not some lawyer's office or courthouse steps, but the parking lot of Riverside Baptist Church, the same place where this story had begun. By 10 o'clock, a small crowd had gathered. Reporters from the Mobile Register and Birmingham News, curious neighbors, and a surprising number of mill workers who'd somehow heard what was happening. Thomas stood at Martha's right side, his hand warm and steady in hers. Sarah sat on his shoulders, her small fingers tangled in his hair, watching everything with the solemn attention of children who understand that adult moments sometimes change the world. Robert Sterling stood slightly apart, giving Martha the spotlight, but offering his presence as support. David Winters had prepared a brief statement, but Martha had folded it into her pocket. The words she needed weren't written by lawyers. Harrison Whitmore's Chevrolet Impala pulled up at precisely 10 o'clock. He emerged with his two companions and a thin smile that suggested he expected Martha to fold. Expected her to understand that poor women didn't fight men with his resources and win. He'd never met anyone like Martha Hayes Sr., and he was about to learn her daughter was cut from the same cloth. "Thank you all for coming," Martha began, her voice steadier than she felt. "My name is Martha Brennan, born Martha Hayes. 3 weeks ago, at my wedding, a man I'd never met gave me the keys to a Cadillac and changed my life. This week, another man I'd never met tried to make me give it back. She could see Whitmore's jaw tighten. Mr. Harrison Whitmore presented me with photographs and allegations designed to make my mother look like a criminal sympathizer. He wanted me to believe that her kindness to a hungry, beaten young man was somehow shameful, that helping someone who'd been disowned and discarded made her a radical. Martha pulled her mother's journal from her purse, holding it up for everyone to see. This belonged to my mother. In it, she wrote about a young man she met in 1950, a man who came to her angry and broken, planning violence against the system that had hurt him. And she told him that anger burns out fast, that real change requires steadier fuel. She opened to a marked page and read aloud. The boy left today, made him promise 3 things: stay alive, stay honest, and remember that cruelty fights dirty because it has to. Justice can afford to fight clean. Martha looked directly at Whitmore. My mother didn't harbor a criminal. She saved a young man from becoming one. She taught him that you can fight for what's right without becoming what's wrong. And because of her, Robert Sterling spent the last 17 years proving that mills can be profitable without being deadly, that workers can be paid fairly without bankrupting companies, that dignity isn't a luxury, it's a baseline. A murmur ran through the crowd. Several of the mill workers nodded, recognition lighting their faces. Mr. Whitmore wants me to be ashamed of my mother's kindness, to see it as weakness or radicalism or something to hide. But I'm not ashamed. I'm proud. Martha's voice grew stronger. My mother worked herself to death at 52, and she died poor. But she died knowing she'd tried to leave the world better than she found it. And she did. Because of her, thousands of workers now labor in safer conditions. Because of her, one man chose mercy over vengeance. Because of her, my daughter has a chance at education I never dreamed possible. Sterling stepped forward, pulling a thick folder from his briefcase. For the record, I have 17 years of correspondence proving everything Mrs. Brennan just said. Letters, dated and postmarked, showing Martha Hayes Sr. consistently counseled peace, reform, and legal channels over violence or sabotage. I also have complete financial documentation proving the trust fund established for Sarah Brennan comes from legitimate patent sales, not mill profits. And I have testimony from 43 current and former employees willing to describe exactly what conditions were like before reforms and after. He handed the folder to the nearest reporter. Mr. Whitmore is welcome to investigate any of this. What he'll find is that the only scandal here is how long Alabama has tolerated the kind of mills he still operates. Whitmore's face had gone red. You self-righteous hypocrite. You inherited millions and now you lecture the rest of us about ethics. I inherited a legacy of cruelty, Sterling interrupted, his voice sharp as broken glass. And I spent 2 decades transforming it into something I could live with. You've had the same opportunity. You've chosen differently. The reporters were scribbling frantically. This was better than whatever statement they'd expected. A real confrontation, documented proof, human drama. The Cadillac stays, Martha said clearly. The trust fund stays. And if Mr. Whitmore wants to spend his time trying to destroy the reputation of a woman who's been dead 6 months, that says everything anyone needs to know about his character. Bill Santos stepped forward from the crowd of mill workers, his voice carrying across the parking lot. I worked at Whitmore Mills for 12 years. Lost my brother to a cotton dust fire that never should have happened. Safety equipment would have cost maybe $5,000. Instead, Bobby got a pine box and my mama got a $100 check marked final settlement. So you can take your pearl clutching about union organizing and choke on it, Harrison. Other voices joined in. Stories of injuries ignored, complaints dismissed, workers fired for asking questions about conditions. Not organized testimony, just the spontaneous overflow of people who'd been silent too long, finding courage in Martha's example. Whitmore looked around at the growing hostility, calculated his odds, and chose retreat. "This isn't over," he said, but everyone could hear the hollow threat in it. "Yes," Martha replied quietly. "It is." He left without another word, his Chevrolet kicking up dust as it accelerated away from the church parking lot. The reporters stayed another 20 minutes, asking questions, taking photographs, getting the human interest story that would run on Sunday, with headlines like "Widow's Kindness Echoes Across Decades" and "Mill Owner's Gift Honors Debt to Humble Hero." But Martha barely registered any of it. She was watching Sarah, still perched on Thomas's shoulders, looking at her mother with an expression of fierce pride that Martha recognized from old mirrors, from faded photographs, from the face of a woman who'd raised her to believe that doing right mattered more than doing easy. Later that evening, after the reporters had gone and the neighbors had drifted home, Martha sat on her front porch with Thomas, watching fireflies write their brief poems against the darkening sky. Sarah was inside, carefully copying a passage from her grandmother's journal into her own notebook, preserving the words for whatever future waited. "You know what the strangest part is?" Martha said softly. "I spent 3 weeks being angry about that Cadillac. Angry at the attention, the gossip, the way it complicated everything. But today, standing there telling Mama's story, I was grateful. Because that car gave me a platform to tell the truth, to say her name in front of people who'll remember it, to make sure she didn't just disappear into poverty and exhaustion like so many women do." Thomas pulled her close. "Your mother raised a warrior. She raised a woman who knows kindness isn't weakness," Martha corrected. "There's a difference." The Cadillac sat in their driveway, midnight blue catching the last rays of sunset, transforming them into something that looked almost like hope. And maybe that's what it had been all along. Not just a car, not just payment for a debt, but physical proof that mercy mattered, that kindness echoed, that small acts of courage could ripple outward in ways you'd never live to see, but mattered just the same. Justice without mercy was just cruelty in a different uniform. But one woman's choice to feed a hungry stranger had saved thousands of lives she'd never meet, in a future she'd never see. That was a legacy worth any price. They say if you drive through Alabama on certain summer evenings, you might spot a midnight blue Cadillac on back roads near Mobile. The woman behind the wheel teaching her daughter what her mother once taught her, that the world is changed not by grand gestures, but by small mercies, repeated faithfully, even when no one's watching. Some swear they've seen it. Others claim it's just a story. But then again, the best truths usually sound like legends. If this story reminded you that kindness matters, that mercy is strength, and that small acts can echo across decades, share it. Subscribe for more stories that prove ordinary people can change the world simply by refusing to look away when someone needs help.